woman was gasping for air on the operating table. Her husband, Thomas Aldridge, paced the hallway with every muscle in his body trembling. The machines were flashing red. The surgeons were frozen. Thomas had spent a lifetime building an empire, hiring top medical talent, demanding nothing but excellence. Yet here in St. Margaret's Hospital, they all admitted defeat. Until someone nobody believed, someone he had dismissed, walked into that room. He had watched her strength for years, ignored her falling into shadows, assumed she was powerless. They dragged her from him, cast her aside like garbage. But now, as Eleanor Aldridge lay teetering between life and death, it was this outcast, once his employee, then homeless, who carried the only thread of hope. How could someone so broken become the difference between living and dying? By the end of this story, you'll see how one discarded soul rewrote everything for a family that thought she had nothing left. But who was this forgotten cleaner? And what secret had the doctors overlooked all along? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Halstrom was a man whose name carried weight in every boardroom across America, a billionaire who commanded fear and respect with every decision he made. His empire was built on relentless discipline and the belief that money could buy solutions to any problem. At his side was Eleanor Halstrom, the woman the public saw as the soft balance to his iron will. Graceful, kind, and deeply admired, she was the one who humanized him in the eyes of those who only knew his ruthless reputation. But behind the glamour of their life together, Eleanor's health had been fragile for years. Doctors had often misread her ailments, treating symptoms but never the cause. And then there was Marissa Kane. Once invisible, now unforgettable. She was a homeless cleaner who had been cast aside, a woman no one took seriously. Yet on the night Eleanor's life hung by a thread, Marissa held a secret that none of the specialists in that sterile hospital could grasp. Why was Eleanor's condition worsening so rapidly despite the team of top doctors at her bedside? What was it that Marissa saw or knew that escaped even the most brilliant medical minds? And why, in the critical moment when seconds mattered, was she treated as a nuisance and thrown into the street? These are the questions that will haunt you as the truth unfolds, because the answers are not only shocking, they will challenge everything we think we know about power, arrogance, and the worth of a human life. Richard Halstrom's empire stretched across industries from steel to finance to technology, a vast machine built on precision and his unrelenting demand for perfection. To the outside world, he was a titan, a man who could bend markets with a single statement. But within his empire, the whispers were darker. Employees knew him as a man without mercy, someone who could fire a senior executive with the same detachment he might dismiss a waiter. Mistakes were unforgivable, weakness intolerable. It was this reputation that earned him the title, the Ice King, a ruler of wealth and power who seemed untouchable. Yet the one force that softened him was Eleanor Halstrom. To the public, Eleanor was not just his wife but the embodiment of compassion. She poured her energy into charities, hospitals, and shelters, often visiting the very communities Richard's policies ignored. Many called her the heart of the Ice King, a woman who reminded everyone that behind the cold marble exterior of Richard's empire, there still existed something human. Their lives seemed unshakable, until the signs began. Eleanor started experiencing strange and recurring health issues, sudden dizziness, fainting spells, unexplainable weakness that no test fully clarified. Doctors, accustomed to dismissing concerns when early scans looked normal, attributed her suffering to stress or fatigue. Richard spared no expense in hiring specialists, yet answers never came. And then there was Marissa Kane. Years before, she had been a promising medical student, known for her brilliance and intuition. But tragedy struck. Her father died suddenly. Her mother fell into illness, bills piled up, and debt crushed her ambition. Addiction followed, a desperate attempt to quiet the pain, and bankruptcy sealed her fate. She lost her home, her career, and her standing in society, reduced now to scrubbing hospital floors to survive. Yet the mind of a healer never left her. Each night as she pushed her mop down sterile corridors, she watched patients and recognized symptoms others ignored. It was in Eleanor Halstrom's face, the pallor, the shortness of breath, the faint tremor in her hands, that Marissa's instincts sparked again. She saw danger where others saw exhaustion, and though she tried to raise her voice, no one listened. She was dismissed as a cleaner, invisible, unworthy of notice. Eleanor's condition, however, continued to deteriorate. The woman the public adored grew weaker with every passing week. Richard demanded answers that never came. Doctors shuffled through files, test results contradicted each other, and confusion mounted. The empire of certainty Richard had built could not shield him from the one reality that unsettled him most. His wife was slipping away, and in the shadows, unnoticed, the only person who truly saw what was happening was Marissa Kane. Eleanor's condition worsened, and no one could explain why. It was the night of the annual Halstrom Foundation Gala, a glittering event where the wealthiest and most powerful gathered under crystal chandeliers to toast the empire Richard Halstrom had built and to honor Eleanor Halstrom for her tireless charitable work. Cameras flashed as she moved gracefully across the ballroom, her presence magnetic, her smile luminous. But those closest to her noticed something different that evening. Her steps were slower, her hand lingered on the arm of a chair for support, and her complexion seemed pale under the lights. Richard, always calculating, brushed off the subtle signs, determined that the evening would proceed without disruption. But fate had other plans. As the orchestra swelled and the glasses clinked, Eleanor swayed, her body suddenly betraying her. She collapsed mid-speech, her hand clutching at the podium before she crumpled to the floor. The room erupted into chaos, guests gasping, reporters snapping photos, aides rushing forward. Richard's mask of icy control shattered as he dropped to his knees beside her, shouting for help. Within minutes, the best doctors in attendance rushed forward, their expertise unmatched, their confidence unshaken. Yet their treatments faltered. Eleanor's pulse slipped, her breathing ragged, her body unresponsive. Richard barked orders with the authority of a general in war. He summoned helicopters, ordered specialists from across the country to be flown in at once, his fortune buying what time could not. In the hospital, Eleanor was placed in the care of the most decorated team Richard's power could assemble, but every second ticked louder, every beep of the monitor more haunting. And there, unnoticed, was Marissa Kane, pushing her mop quietly along the corridor, her uniform stained from another long shift. She heard the frantic discussion spilling from behind the glass, caught the desperate tones of men who seemed less certain than they appeared. She stopped, listened, and realized with chilling clarity that something was wrong. The diagnosis they clung to was flawed, the treatments misaligned. Marissa's old instincts, honed in medical school before her life unraveled, surged within her. She stepped into the room, her voice trembling but determined, pointing out the signs no one else acknowledged, the small but crucial detail that spelled the difference between life and death. Instead of listening, security descended upon her. The doctors dismissed her words as irrelevant. Richard's staff branded her an intruder. She was shoved back into the hallway, her protests echoing against sterile walls. Humiliated, silenced, and pushed outside, her warnings evaporated into the cold night air. Inside, Eleanor's body fought for survival, her fragile heart giving way under the weight of misdiagnosis. And as Marissa's voice faded behind slammed doors, Eleanor's heart monitor flatlined. The morning after Eleanor Halstrom's collapse, the world woke to headlines that shook both Wall Street and Main Street alike. Billionaire's wife on brink of death. News outlets across the nation replayed shaky footage from the gala, showing Eleanor crumpling to the floor as horrified guests rushed to her aid. Paparazzi swarmed St. Margaret's Hospital, cameras flashing at every glimpse of Richard Halstrom's grim face as he entered and exited through private corridors. The man who had controlled markets could not control the fate of his wife, and the media was relentless in its coverage. Inside the hospital, chaos reigned. The finest physicians, cardiologists, and surgeons huddled in heated arguments. Some swore Eleanor was suffering from acute heart failure, pointing to irregular rhythms on her scans. Others suspected poison or an undetected toxin, citing her sudden collapse without prior warning. The conflicting diagnoses left her treatment fractured, every decision a gamble. Richard Halstrom was livid. He stormed through the ward, berating the staff, accusing them of incompetence. His fury was legendary, but this time it was fueled not by business failure, but by fear. He demanded answers, but none came. Behind the walls of his empire, whispers began to stir. Board members and rivals alike questioned what Eleanor's death might mean for Richard's control. Would sympathy strengthen his hold, or would it fracture the perception of his invincibility? The uncertainty gnawed at his empire like termites in the beams of a mansion. Meanwhile, Marissa Kane sat on the cold steps outside the hospital, shivering in the night air. Security had thrown her out without a second thought, her protests silenced by the thud of heavy doors. Her heart ached as she imagined Eleanor lying inside, subjected to treatments she knew were wrong. She debated with herself. Should she risk everything to return, to speak again, to defy the humiliation? Or had the world already made its judgment, condemning her to invisibility no matter what truth she carried? Back inside, the doctors reached a desperate conclusion. With time running out, they chose to attempt a high-risk surgery, one that promised slim hope, but carried devastating risk. Richard, cornered and helpless, gave his consent. The procedure began under the harsh glare of surgical lights, but hope faded quickly. Complications set in. Eleanor's fragile body resisted the intrusion, and monitors screamed warnings the team could not silence. Richard watched from behind glass as his wife's condition spiraled further out of reach. His empire could buy time, but not certainty, and not life. He was told in hushed tones to prepare for the inevitable, to begin considering the words no man of power ever wished to hear. There is nothing more we can do. And yet, as despair closed in around him, fate had not finished its cruel game. Richard was told to prepare for his wife's death. But fate had one last card to play. The sterile corridors of St. Margaret's Hospital were lined with reporters pressing their cameras against the glass, desperate for a glimpse of the Halstrom tragedy. Inside, time bled away with every sluggish beep of Eleanor Halstrom's faltering heart monitor. Doctors whispered grimly, their confidence fractured. Richard Halstrom paced like a caged lion, barking orders, calling in more specialists, his reputation as the ruthless master of control now mocked by his own helplessness. Outside, Marissa Kane's resolve hardened. The humiliation of being shoved out, the sting of cold air on her face, it all churned into something sharper. Defiance. She had seen enough. Eleanor didn't have days left. She had minutes. Marissa pushed past the double doors once more, ignored the shouts of security, and slipped back into the shadows of the ward. A sympathetic nurse, one who had seen the desperation in Marissa's eyes earlier, hesitated at her station. When Marissa whispered, "Please, she'll die if I don't get in there," the nurse made the smallest, riskiest choice of her career. She looked the other way. Marissa crept toward the intensive care unit, her heartbeat matching the frantic rhythm of alarms echoing from inside Eleanor's room. And when she stepped in, Richard Halstrom turned on her with a look that could freeze stone. "Not you again," he hissed, motioning to security. But before they dragged her away, Marissa raised her trembling voice. "I know what's killing her. I studied this condition. I've seen it before." The room fell silent. For a fleeting moment, even the monitors seemed to pause. Richard narrowed his eyes, his patience razor-thin. "You? A cleaner? You're going to tell me what my wife needs?" Marissa swallowed hard, her voice quivering but steady. "I wasn't always a cleaner. I was a medical student, one of the best, before I lost everything. And Eleanor's case. It's not heart failure. It's not poison. It's an obscure reaction, one almost no one recognizes." Gasps rippled through the team of doctors, their pride insulted. A senior cardiologist sneered. Ridiculous, we've run every test. Marissa's jaw tightened. You tested the wrong markers. Years ago, I worked under a professor who studied this exact reaction. Eleanor's symptoms, her sudden collapse, the irregular rhythm, the unresponsiveness to standard treatments. It's all consistent. You're treating the wrong problem. You're killing her with every minute wasted. Richard's face hardened, his disbelief unshaken. He barked at security. Get her out of here. Hands closed around Marissa's arms. She twisted, resisting. If I'm wrong, you can throw me on the street forever. But if I'm right, if you keep ignoring me, Eleanor dies tonight. The orderlies pulled her toward the door. Richard raised his voice to silence the room. Enough. I don't take advice from vagrants who scrub floors. And then, Eleanor Halstrom coded blue. The room erupted in chaos, alarms screaming, doctors scrambling to restart her faltering heart. For Richard, the sound was like the world collapsing. His wife, his anchor, was slipping into the void before his eyes. Marissa, still held by security, cried out, "Let me try. You've got nothing left." Richard's fists clenched. Pride screamed at him to throw her out, to bury the humiliation of entertaining such desperation. But fear, raw, primal fear, broke through. He looked at his wife, pale and motionless, and then at Marissa, her eyes ablaze with certainty. With a single hoarse command, he changed everything. Let her in. Security froze. The doctors stared in disbelief. Marissa Kane was released. She stepped forward, hands trembling, the weight of her past and present colliding. For the first time since her fall from grace, she stood not as the discarded woman the world ignored, but as the only person who might hold the key to Eleanor's survival. And in that moment, the woman the world had written off placed her trembling hands on the tools of life and death. The room seemed frozen in time as Marissa Kane, with shaking hands steadied by sheer determination, stepped up to the bedside of Eleanor Halstrom. Every doctor present, men and women with decades of experience and titles that carried weight in medical journals, fell silent as they watched someone they had dismissed as nothing more than a cleaner move, with confidence they themselves had failed to muster. Marissa's voice rang clear as she called for specific instruments, ones the others had neglected in their rush to treat the wrong condition. Her hands moved quickly, guided not by arrogance, but by instinct, sharpened through years of hard study and the sting of failure. She adjusted Eleanor's airway, corrected the medication dosage, and performed the obscure intervention that had lived only in her memory since her days as a medical student. The monitors screamed, then steadied, then beeped in a rhythm so fragile yet undeniable. Eleanor Halstrom's heart was beating again. The silence broke with gasps. Nurses pressed hands to their mouths, tears welling. The senior doctors who had ridiculed Marissa stood motionless, unable to argue with the evidence before them. Richard Halstrom, the man known for breaking competitors and crushing rivals, crumpled into the chair at his wife's side. His iron mask shattered as he buried his face in his hands and sobbed like a man who had just been handed back his soul. Eleanor's pale fingers twitched, a sign of life returning, and Richard grasped them as though anchoring himself to a miracle he did not deserve. Word of the astonishing turn spread like wildfire. Headlines the next morning carried a story no one could have scripted. Billionaire's wife saved by homeless cleaner. Reporters swarmed the hospital, cameras flashing, eager to expose the woman behind the impossible recovery. But Marissa Kane refused the spotlight. When Richard Halstrom offered her money, status, even the chance to live under his protection, she shook her head with quiet resolve. "I don't want to be your charity," she said softly. "All I've ever wanted is a chance to stand again on my own, to be seen as more than what the world has reduced me to." Richard, a man who had built empires with cold efficiency, was left speechless. For the first time in his life, he understood that not everything could be bought, not every debt could be repaid with money. What Marissa had given him was beyond value. She had returned Eleanor to him, but she had also shown him the arrogance that had nearly cost everything. In saving Eleanor, Marissa had awakened something long dead inside Richard Halstrom: humility. The final truth struck harder than any headline. Eleanor Halstrom had survived, yes, but perhaps the real life saved that night was Richard's own. The ruthless billionaire who had once measured worth in dollars and contracts now stood forever indebted to a woman who owned nothing but her dignity. And as Marissa walked away from the hospital, into the uncertain dawn of her second chance, the world was forced to reckon with a haunting question. How many lives are overlooked, silenced, erased, because society chooses to see only status and not the worth within? If you were Richard Halstrom, standing in that cold, sterile room, would you have trusted Marissa Kane? Or would you have ignored her like everyone else did? Think about that for a moment. A man with everything, money, influence, the power to bend institutions to his will, nearly lost the one person he loved most because society had already decided Marissa Kane was worthless. How many times have we looked away from someone who seemed invisible, someone struggling on the margins, not realizing they might hold wisdom or strength greater than we could imagine? Did arrogance almost kill Eleanor Halstrom that night? Or was it something deeper, a flaw in how we as a society decide whose voice matters? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear the story of the millionaire who tested his maid with a fortune in gold, and what she did next will leave you absolutely speechless. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it.